Welcome. So this is the Women Listening to Women, a history of self-injury and mental health activism. My name is Hannah Cadogan. I'm actually a palliative care nurse. So I work in the area of nursing where we look after people with life-limiting conditions. But I'm actually hosting this because I have a diagnosis of a severe and enduring mental health diagnosis. And I actually have lived experience of using mental health services. And this event is actually being hosted by the Royal College of Nursing Library. The Royal College of Nursing is actually a UK-based organisation that represents nurses, midwives, student nurses, and nursing support workers, just for anyone who's international and doesn't know. And more specifically, it's been actually hosted by the Royal College of Nursing Mental Health Forum. And I am the representative for lived experience in that forum. And we're hoping that with that, we can expand the important voice of lived experience inside mental health, but also wider to the rest of healthcare. The reason that we are here today, which is all very exciting, is to actually hear about the history of the British Crisis Service for women. This service was set up in April 1986 and is actually today known as the Self-Injury Support Service. The Self-Injury Support Service is a UK-wide self-harm and self-injury charity that offers a peer-to-peer listening and support service. So I find this really fantastic because actually in my own mental health background, it was peers that helped me at a massive amount. We will be, though, however, talking about self-injury and mental health. And that may raise examples of traumatic experiences. So I do want you to be aware that if you need to take time out of this session, please do just leave and you can rejoin at any time. If that's too much for you, we are actually recording this session, so you can actually watch it online at a later date if that's better for you. The other important thing to say is that the self-injury support helpline is going to be open this evening until 9:30. So you can actually reach them on 08 800 8088. I'm going to repeat that again for anybody who needs it because I think this is important. So this is the Self-Injury Support Helpline. Will be open until 9:30 and the number is 08 800 8088. You can also look at the self-injury website, which has a section on it for support groups. And the website is www.selfinjurysupport.uk/support-groups. And you can actually just put in the browser self-injury support and you will actually find the organisation. So with all of that to do, I think that it's be good now to actually just introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Sarah Shaney. She is a historian of medicine at Queen Mary Centre for the History of Emotions and the events and exhibition manager at the Royal College of Nursing. Her first book, Psyche on the Skin, explored the history of self-injury and the myths and stereotypes associated with it, alongside her own lived experience. And I've actually got her book here, and I would really recommend it. I've actually read it, and it's really insightful, and I would really recommend the book. And it's a real pleasure, actually, Sarah, that you've come to speak with us today. So I'm going to pass on to you, if that's all right, unless I've missed anything, Francis. I'll pass on to Sarah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Hannah. And thanks very much for that introduction. So, Hannah said, I'm going to be talking a little bit this evening from my book on the history of self-injury. I am going to be mentioning some specific types of self-injury. So just a warning in advance that will be in the content because it's relevant to the presentation, but I'm not going to describe anything in graphic detail. So I want to start with one specific example, going back to 1875. A woman named Mrs. Helen Miller was transferred to the New York State Asylum for Insane Criminals, as it was called, from Sing Sing Prison, where she had a 5-year sentence for grand larceny. And the reason for her transfer was described here and the quote on the slide by who wrote about her case. As he said, being anxious to be transferred to the asylum, she began to cut up, as she expresses it, and finally was transferred and readmitted in July 1875. But once transferred to the asylum, Mrs. Miller continued to injure herself over the next few years, usually by cutting her arms. Interestingly, as her physician, Walter Channing, noted, Mrs. Miller's method of self-injury was very unusual for the time, and we'll hear a little bit more about this shortly. However, the explanation that he gave for her behaviour is something that comes up repeatedly over the following century, and it's shaped attitudes to self-injury ever since. So as Dr. Channing claimed, it was the patient's age, her sex, her frequent episodes of unexplained medical symptoms, which included choking and painful menstruation, and a past with compulsive stealing or kleptomania, as he called it. These all suggested a diagnosis at the time of hysteria. So as Channing put it, in the present case, the hysterical element was always present. The wounds were made as lacerated as possible, the garments were covered unnecessarily with blood, and a time of day chosen when help was sure to be at hand. Everything was done to produce as much effect as possible. Now, the Helen Miller case has been used by some modern psychiatrists to support the idea that non-suicidal self-injury is a universal, timeless phenomenon with a set of associated traits. And this completely misses the point that the author of this article thought that it wasn't typical at all. So I think something that's very important in the history of psychiatry and medicine in general is not to cherry pick ideas from the past that support modern notions of self-injury, and we need to take a more critical view. So these are myths around self-harm. And I'm starting with these myths because when I started my research into the history of self-harm in the 19th century, these are sort of assumptions I was often met with. So people would ask, surprised, whether self-injury actually happened before the late century. They'd assume it's a modern phenomenon. Somebody asked me, was it mostly women who injured themselves in the 19th century like today? No, it wasn't. And then somebody else asked, did I mean self-cutting by self-harm? And that's not the case. So the answer to all these questions is a resounding no. And I think by looking at the history of self-injury, we can see the way in which these very limited and limiting stereotypes are created, and how they then lead to assumptions being made about people on the basis of their actions and also of their gender, and then a failure to engage with their experiences. So I'm going to talk very briefly in a bit more detail about these myths. So first of all, self-harm is very much not a modern phenomenon. So I first became interested in the topic as a historian, rather than someone experiencing self-harm, which has a rather longer history for me, when I was researching in the records at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital. And in the 1850s patient casebooks, up until 1853, in fact, when Bethlehem standardised their casebooks, the admission papers asked whether any patient is disposed to suicide or otherwise to self-injury. And I think I've got a close-up of that. And I thought this was quite interesting because it suggested that these two things were separate, albeit related behaviours. So there was something to distinguish self-injury from suicide. And in fact, when I began to look into this further, there turned out to be quite a lot of discussion in the later 19th century around these categories, and particularly definitions of what they called at the time self-mutilation. One of the key definitions here is in Daniel Hakchuk's Dictionary of Psychological Medicine, which you can see the frontispiece of it here. A psychiatrist named James Adam wrote a 5-page definition of what he called self-mutilation. And this is important because before this time, the last couple of decades of the 19th century, nobody had really considered that there might be a link between different kinds of self-injurious acts. And that's not really self-evident or obvious that there would be a similarity in behaviours between, say, somebody picking their skin or somebody attempting to cut off their own hands. But this link that's assumed there's something similar about these things has continued in models of self-harm ever since. And it was also, of course, very much cemented a link with mental illness as well, which again had not always been the case previously. As James Adam put it in his definition of self-mutilation, rather vaguely characteristic of Victorian psychiatrists, all the states of mind leading to self-mutilation, self-torture, etc., hitherto considered, are compatible with reputed sanity, although they are to insanity near akin, and generally indicate more or less mental derangement, so rather hedging his bets there. So self-harm's not a modern phenomenon. And then the second thing that I want to look at is the fact that all genders are affected by self-injury. And in fact, what's very interesting in the late 19th century is that self-mutilation was more commonly thought of as a behaviour linked to men rather than to women. And this is quite linked to a very particular case of a young farmer named Isaac Brooks. Now, Isaac Brooks, in 1879, I believe, had called his doctor to attend him for an injury. He'd had an injury to his genitals, which he claimed he'd been attacked by several men who had injured him. And Brooks was treated by his doctor and subsequently encouraged to name the men who had attacked him, and several men were imprisoned for this crime. Now, the same injury occurred again a couple of years later, and this time Brooks refused to say who had attacked him. But it was actually on Isaac Brooks's deathbed in December 1881 of an unrelated illness, where he confessed that the men were innocent, and that in fact the injuries had been self-inflicted. And this led to a lot of writing about the case in the popular press, in the local press, in the national press, and also in medical journals as well. And medical journals like The Lancet were very determined that, as they put it, the Brooks case was no isolated one. There are many well-authenticated cases of youths and men of all ages who have sometimes successfully, at others unsuccessfully, performed this painful operation upon themselves. Now, they gave no evidence for this statement, no evidence of these cases. And in fact, it's very interesting when I looked at those cases that were reported in medical journals in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, 1880 to 1900, and what was being reported in institutions. You can see a real difference in what's being found. So the yellow bars that you can see on this chart here show the proportion of articles focusing on a particular behaviour. And you can see kind of a third of the way down that castration was far and away reported on by reported about more than anything else in medical journals. More than 25% of articles were about that topic. However, it was much more common in institutions to find staff recording instances of people injuring themselves in other ways by picking at their skin or by knocking themselves. And yet the fact that there were all these published cases about a particular behaviour very quickly led to the idea that this was the kind of main form of self-injury at the time. So by the end of the 19th century, 2 American doctors in their Anomalies and Curiosities of Medicine, Gould and Pyle, made the claim from all these published articles that self-mutilation in man is almost invariably the result of meditation over the generative function, and the great majority of cases of this nature are avulsions or amputations of some parts of the genitalia. So they made this claim that self-injury was a male behaviour and there was this particular kind of injury. So I think we've already seen that self-injury is not just about people cutting themselves, and the kind of archetypes and understandings of self-injury are themselves historically created. And that was also the case with the idea of self-cutting as well. So when somebody asked me whether that was something that came up a lot in the 19th century, I was interested in the fact that the main examples that I did find of that in the mid to late 19th century tended to be self-therapeutics. They were very much linked to bloodletting. So this quote here comes from the Bethlehem Hospital patient casebook of 1860, a woman named Elizabeth Taylor, who, when she was admitted, it was described that she has had latterly some indications of a wish to injure herself, to draw blood which she fancies would relieve her. But then goes on to say that because of this, without any obvious cause or previously speaking of it, she rushed into a chemist's shop and asked to be cupped immediately. So cupping at the time was actually available as a form of a remedy for any sort of illness or distress. And in fact, it was Taylor's compulsion to do it without actually appearing to have any rational reason or having spoken about it to anyone beforehand that was seen as more problematic than the act itself. And it wasn't actually until the 1960s that self-cutting began to be seen as the kind of main kind of self-injury. And this was because of the focus of a few private psychoanalytic hospitals in the northeastern United States. So they started to publish a number of studies on patients that they'd started to call wrist slashers or wrist cutters. And this is the first time that there'd been a focus on this idea of a syndrome. And this really did as much to create the idea of the so-called self-cutter as to describe what actually existed. And it was a very, very gendered profile as well. So there are many, many quotes like this. So I've just chosen one from Gruff and Mallin's article, where they stated that the typical cutter was an attractive young woman, aged 23, usually quite intelligent. More than half had attended college. 3/4 were unmarried, although most of them were old enough to be married. So you often get these judgments about what's the expected behaviour for young women by these older male psychiatrists, the expectation that young women ought to be married at the age of 23. They also set up this profile, this gendered profile, by excluding any patients that didn't represent these categories that they had created. Usually this was excluding those patients who were male from the studies, and they also ignored any other kinds of injury carried out by patients, although there were very many other kinds of ways in which people injured themselves. So, for example, in one study, there were 24 women and 8 men in the study. The psychiatrist writing it immediately declared that he wouldn't say anything about the men because they weren't typical. However, this was in a hospital at which more than 2/3 of the patients overall were female. So you would expect there to be rather more women in the study, and that was completely ignored. And these gendered judgments were also often made by writing about if the occasional man was written about in the study, they would usually be described as effeminate, and everything was recorded in very gendered terms. And the other side of this was that these psychiatrists would then completely ignore the concerns of the patients about the way their gender affected the way they were treated. So one example I have here is in Pingney Powell's article on the syndrome of delicate self-cutting, where he claims that his patient Miss B spoke job disadvantage, not a reality, and reiterated her wish to be a man. And how Powell knew that it was not a reality, that Miss B had suffered job at disadvantage, rather surprising. As he says, she sought equality between the sexes, applied to be an acolyte. She applied for other positions as well and was turned down. So POW's therapy for these patients aimed at encouraging them to accept these barriers. So once they had accepted their place in a very gendered society, he concludes with the idea that Miss B, with a new insight, she could finally relinquish her urge to compete with men. It was this that led towards cure. And these expectations and ideas around women and self-injury are also linked to the fourth and last myth that I wanted to touch on today, the idea of self-harm as attention-seeking. And I think the thing that really explodes this is when we look at where this idea actually came from in the first place. So we go back to Mrs. Miller and the idea, which was very much bound up with the idea of attention-seeking. In the very end of the 19th century, in the early 20th century, self-injury in men was seen usually as either severe mental illness or an attempt at malingering, so an injury in order to avoid work or to make financial gain. But psychiatrists increasingly started to write about this idea of what they called motiveless malingering or hysterical deception, the idea that among women, especially middle-class women who didn't need to work, they were putting themselves, as George Savage did, to great personal torture without any apparent object. And then you often get this link made in text between hysteria and injury. So the photograph here is actually from a text that's just illustrating other symptoms within hysteria. It's illustrating the gait of hysteria, but then has a comment in it of you can see the marks of self-injury scars on the patient's legs. And this is all summed up in an article by Frederick Parks Weber on the association of hysteria with malingering. And Weber claimed that not only was hysteria a female diagnosis and the hysterical attention-seeking personality a female trait, but this in fact explained self-injury in women. So as he put it, in past ages, simulation or deception of various kinds must often have been serviceable to the weaker female in protecting herself from the stronger and sometimes cruel male, as well as in enabling her sometimes to get her own way. Therefore, at the present time, the facility, instinct for deception is probably greater in the average female than in the average male. So Weber's ideas about self-injury in women very much come from ideas about women in general, this assumption that women must, through an evolutionary psychology, be more deceptive than men. And this idea of women being as deceptive was used by Weber to explain the fact that he had encountered some women who injured themselves. So just very briefly to conclude, I want to go back to all of these myths. So as we've seen in my talk, self-harm is not a modern phenomenon. It's something that all genders experience. It's not just about cutting, and self-harm is not an attention-seeking behaviour. And I think this, recognising that this stereotype is rooted in negative attitudes towards women in general is really important for addressing this last one. And overall, reduction to a category that self-injury can be problematic because we fail to appreciate how all of these ideas have arisen from a specific historical context. So, for example, these very different attitudes to gender or a lack of opportunities for women, as we saw with Miss B. So when we start to view self-harm as a problem in and of itself, then that leads us to fail to engage seriously with people's reasons for doing it. And that's still important today, that to see mental illness or self-injury as somehow separate from the society people live in, the political, financial, cultural, and social problems that they have, is to misunderstand it entirely. And you can find more about that in my book. So thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you ever so much. I just think knowing the historical context of, the kind of history is just incredible, really, in that understanding and the journey we're still on in understanding and being a much more understanding about self-injury and self-harm. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I hope so. I can see that people are saying thank you, and it's a brilliant presentation. So I'm actually going to move on to our next speaker, who is Jeanette Copperman. Jeanette is a senior lecturer in social work at the Open University. And while working as a social worker, she set up the Southwark Women and Mental Health Forum, which was a coalition of professionals and service users aiming to improve service provision locally, and was a founder member of the National Women and Mental Health Network. Welcome, Jeanette. Really looking forward to your talk. And yeah, I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk today just about really the background to the work that Rosie is going to talk about later. The history of Bristol Crisis Service for Women, and I want to explore some of the initiatives and campaigns that have taken place to challenge existing mental health services and create change for women from the 1970s onwards. We're now 20 years from the Department of Health National Women and Mental Health Strategy, which you can see here. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, which brought together many of the campaigns and the evidence and the voices of women. Although we got that policy, I'm not sure how much of that has ever been turned into mainstream practice. But what we do have is a massive kind of wealth of experience, of projects, of evidence now that has built up over this period. And I'm going to talk about a few of those things. We're also 50 years on from Phyllis Chesler's book, Women and Madness, where she asked for $1 million in reparations for those women who had never been helped by the mental health professions, but who had been instead further abused, punitively labelled, and for overly tranquilized, sexually seduced whilst in treatment, hospitalized against their will, given shock treatment, lobotomized, and above all disliked as too aggressive, promiscuous, depressed, ugly, old, disgusting, and incurable. And I did hesitate before I put this slide in, actually, because I thought this is, we want to kind of celebrate the achievements and how far we've come, but also perhaps there's a place to also look at where we haven't, where those attitudes still kind of persist, really. I'm going to be arguing that we need to be collecting, teaching and making visible our radical histories for future generations and for ourselves, and that being able to revisit our past is integral to being able to understand and interpret our present and also to imagine our future. There are ongoing challenges, but also revisiting our past allows us to acknowledge our achievements, such as the range of alternative models for supporting women in distress that organisations like Bristol Crisis Services for Women, which has set up in 1986 and is still going. The creation of women's crisis houses, and I'm thinking here of Drayton Park, which was set up in 1995, but there are other women's crisis houses too, for example, in Birmingham. The putting of sexual safety in mental health services onto the mainstream agenda. And when I was preparing for this talk, I looked at the RCN website, and I could see that there's a tranche of work going on around and unpicking sexual safety, looking at the evidence, looking at how practice can take account of that, and how women and others can be made safer in services. And the mental health consequences of domestic abuse, which when we started this work in the 80s and the 90s was something that was very much not in evidence. And the work also done by organisations like Southall Black Sisters and New Asian Women's Project to highlight the issues facing Black and ethnic minority women and the impact on their mental health. So just to go back to that, 8 years ago in 2014, we held a workshop at the Open University to bring together 20 activists and former activists the scope creating a digital archive of women's mental health activism. And I'm kind of glad to say that we now have agreement from Bishopsgate Institute that's going to host that archive. And it took 6 years, but we managed to get funding for the first of the projects, the history projects, really to look at and to start to unpick our history with Bristol Crisis Services for Women, which Rosie will be talking about. But I'm really hoping that that's just going to be the first of these history projects, and that I know that, for example, women in special hospitals are interested in taking work forward in terms of the work that they've done. And I'm going to be arguing that it's really important for us to kind of capture this activist work. Otherwise, we leave footprints in the sand. At that workshop, one of the things that we asked in 2014, we asked women, and this might be something that you yourselves were interested in just thinking about and doing, about key texts that they'd looked at and key kind of influences on them. And we were trying to put together a timeline as well of different things that had happened. So these were some of the texts that women came up with. I've already talked about Phyllis Chester a little bit, but about how a sexist society really she was looking very much at a sexist society, and I would argue a racist society makes us kind of mad. The Broverman was the first. They interviewed 79 clinicians and looked at how they saw a mentally healthy adult male, a mentally healthy adult person, and a mentally healthy adult female, and concluded that how a mentally healthy adult person was seen was alongside a mentally healthy adult male with traits such as kind of independence and, getting on with things, not being, emotionally dependent and so on. So that women by their very nature there was a sex bias for women by their very nature. The Nibbert study was one of the first studies that I could find when I started looking at sex assault within psychiatric settings. And it's an American study that was done, which didn't break down assaults by sex. But when I started to look at this as an issue, as a result of a rape having been reported, when I was working within Southwark Women and Mental Health Forum, there was virtually nothing that had been written from the point of view of women in institutions. The only literature that I could find was pathologizing of women's sexuality and discounting of any real reports of the lived experience of being either in a long stay or a short stay institution and the kind of practices that were happening within that. One of the books that certainly for me was influential, and I know for a number of other women was Judith Lewis Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, which situated domestic abuse and the mental health consequences of being subject to rape and domestic abuse alongside what happened to men in the political kind of sphere, which had long been recognised within war, for example. And post-traumatic stress disorder. And in the good practices for mental health for women, I think this was an early attempt, if you like, at intersectionality, at thinking about not all women are the same. We have many differences between us. And there was an attempt within that to tease out the mental health issues for different groups of women. And indeed, I've listed as well the work by the Asian Women's Project looking at young Asian women and self-harm and really highlighting the issues for South Asian women. So that's just from trauma and recovery. This testimony of trauma survivors is at the heart of this book. This book appears at a time when public discussion of the common atrocities sexual and domestic life has been made possible by the women's movement. And I think that was one of the kind of achievements, in a sense, to be able to make visible things that people had not wanted to talk about before. I expect this book to be controversial. First, because it's written from a feminist perspective. Second, because it challenges established diagnostic concepts. But third, because it speaks about horrible things which no one really wants to hear about. And I would argue that another real achievement around this time was the kind of challenging of certain diagnostic concepts. For example, battles took place around masochistic personality disorder, which there was a proposal to kind of enter that into the diagnostic statistical manual in the 1980s. Borderline personality disorder, sadly, I would argue that did get included. But also we have the post-traumatic stress disorder. And all of this was the result of a kind of a political process that took place really around how we view women's mental health. Okay. And these are some of the personal accounts as well, which have been very powerful. And I know certainly when I'm teaching students, or was teaching in mental health with students, it was very important to kind of look at these. And I was thinking there about Louise Pembroke's work, which I know is featured in the podcasts that go alongside the Bristol Crisis Services for Women, our project. Okay. Oh. Sorry, this is not... Oh, here we go. My own history of organising was as a women's mental health activist was in the 1980s and 1990s, and started off with setting up Southwark Women and Mental Health Forum while I worked at Southwark Council as a women's advisor. It came out of a request from the Maudsley Hospital to get council representation onto their Equal Opportunities group. And then I became part of founding and helping to run the National Women and Mental Health Forum, which ran as a collective between 1996 and 2002. At its height, there were around 200 members, individuals and groups. We produced the forums, which came out twice a year using gestetners and printing, stuffing envelopes. There was no email and no internet at that time. And both the Southwark Group and the Forum were a coalition of women who worked in mental health services and women who used mental health services. And those of us who had identities that actually crossed those boundaries. And I'd argue that was quite important. There were many robust discussions and different points of view. We had both the Department of Health as a member of the National Women and Mental Health Forum, as well as women who were incarcerated in special hospitals. And it was sent, the Women and Mental Health Forum was sent free to women in hospitals. And just to give you an idea of some of this, is really a tiny snapshot of the organisations that were around, and some are still around at this time. I think most of these, not all of these, are around, but they were. And how important it is also to kind of capture this history. When I went to Mind, actually, to talk to them, I rang up Mind Policy Unit because I wanted to use some images from Stress on Women Year. And the Mind Policy Unit had never heard, the current Mind Policy Unit had never heard of Mind Stress on Women Year, which kind of illustrates in a way just how quickly we can lose this kind of history that can ground us. There are many organisations that are not on this list, and might know of many of them. I'm just going to carry on. So I would argue that key influences were second wave feminism and the women's health movement. Our Bodies or Cells, some women here might remember seeing. The anti-psychiatry of the 60s and 70s and the emergence of the mental health survivor movement, and the privileging, the resistance, the medicalisation of the body and the dominance of doctors, and the development of kind of collective forms of knowledge, of true discussion about our own views of mental health. I thought I'd put this in because this was a day where we brought together many different groups, and you might recognise some of the women on this on here. I don't know if everyone can see it, but there was also a project at that time. I know when you walk into psychiatric hospitals, they're often full of the kind of busts of white men, and on the walls there's kind of these pictures of kind of old white men. And this was an attempt to kind of reconfigure and to resituate and to put in women and to think about who might be in there. So I'm just going to carry on and look at two activist moments very quickly. And one is the Stress on Women campaign, which I've briefly talked about. The key demands of that, this is the Mind Stress on Women campaign, with an end to sexual harassment and abuse in mental health settings, the right for women to choose a woman care manager or key worker, childcare for people who use mental health services, and service provision to be monitored by gender, and an action to end unfair treatment. And alongside this was the demand for women to be able to access women-only wards, or to have a choice of women-only wards, which I believe is still not really the case in all places. In the context of adult mental health services, we found there was often a resistance to thinking about the specificity of women's lives. And for example, the demand to have childcare in mental health services, in counselling services, in outpatient and inpatient clinics, we found that small organisations, small women's organisations, felt able to run a creche, whilst large organisations were very reluctant to put kind of creche facilities in. For example, at the Maudsley Hospital, their own research showed that having 3 children under the Brown and Harris research showed that having 3 children under the age of 10 and a lack of a close confiding relationship made you more likely to become depressed. When they were rebuilding the hospital, it was great consternation when it was suggested they might put a creche in the outpatient kind of clinic so that women could have a kind of hour to themselves, whilst a small voluntary organisation round the corner with 2 workers managed to do that. So, I mean, this was kind of it was challenging, really, the mental health services to think about the specificity of women's lives. It was a national campaign right across the country, and different groups took this into different directions. It was also a campaign to influence politicians and the media, and indeed there was pushback, as they say, from many organisations on this. So far from being welcomed universally, actually, at the time, many of the things that were being said were kind of fairly unpopular, actually. And it's interesting to think about how far that has come in terms of now having authoritative women and an evidence base. So, for example, I talked about the rape that was reported early on in working in the Southwark group. And one of the things, this was one of the issues, safety within services was one of the kind of issues that we campaigned on. Services, far from being a safe place relationally for women, were not always a safe place even physically. At the time, a lot of the accommodation was in dormitories. Mind and others took up this campaign, and we eventually achieved recognition by government and guidance on single-sex wards, but which still has to be completely implemented. So there's still work to do. So here are some, I think, from my point of view, some of the key themes, really. The personal is political, and the importance of survivor testimony, the resistance to medical domination and diagnosis, safety I've talked about, motherhood, mental distress, and childcare was also taken apart. This idealisation of mothering, and the social context of mothering and mental distress kind of put back in there. Resistance to stereotyping and notions of femininity and the diversity of needs, really. And I'm aware that I'm kind of running out of time. So just to say very briefly that the National Women Mental Health Forum covered a number of these issues. And one of the things that we're hoping to do as part of this history project is to digitalise a number of the resources from that time within Bishopsgate Institute. We've had our first collection is in Bishopsgate, and I know that we will be putting the interviews from the Bristol Crisis Service for Women into Bishopsgate. And I would really encourage people to dig out all those things that you might have under the bed or you might be thinking about throwing away, and to see them as really valuable information and resources for the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nat. That was so rich and full of so much. So I'm going to go on to now Rosie Wild. Rosie is a community history worker at the Self-Injury Support, formerly known as the Bristol Crisis for Women. She has a PhD in 20th century British history and specialised in the history from the ground up, which I think is great. Her passion is working with marginalised communities to uncover the hidden history among the everyday. So welcome, Rosie, and I'll hand over to you. And just like with our other two speakers, really excited to hear your talk. So thank you for joining us.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that introduction. I am just trying to... Super. So yes, I worked for Self-Injury Support, which before 2014 was known as Bristol Crisis Service for Women. And for the last 2 years, I've been leading this project with a team of 10 volunteers, an oral history project where we've been interviewing current and former volunteers and staff members from Bristol Crisis Service for Women and Self-Injury Support to create a public archive at Bishopsgate Institute, which, as Jeanette mentioned, will fit into a wider archive of women and mental health activism that she has created, which is fantastic. The project's funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And if you are in an organisation and you do want to try and preserve your own history, I thoroughly recommend the National Lottery Heritage Fund as a funding source for that. The application is hell to write, but once you've got the money, they fund really good and really quite radical work. So that's my tip. So the project's now very, very nearly at the end. We've done all our work and we've created all the things we were going to create, which I'll tell you about at the end of this talk. All I'd say about that is maybe if you're going to do a history project of your own, try not to do it in the middle of a COVID pandemic, because that makes it a little bit harder. Anyway, I don't have time to talk to you in great detail about the history of the Bristol Crisis Service for Women, but the bare bones of it all are as follows. So it was set up as a feminist collective in April 1986 by women who had mainly had personal experience of self-injury, but it was set up collectively as a democratic collective. It was explicitly feminist, but it was also part of the survival movement. These women, some of whom had been in psychiatric institutions and had received diagnoses which they rejected, and they rejected the medical model of mental illness, and they wanted to create an organisation that filled gaps that they thought were woefully missing in general psychiatric help, and they wanted to put lived experience at the heart of the treatment. So to that end, they created in January 1988 a peer-to-peer listening service, a helpline. The organisation was almost completely run by volunteers, entirely run by volunteers at the staff, and then just had one member of staff from 1990. For a lot of its early years, it only had one member of staff and all the rest was volunteers. And then they'd get project funding and bring staff in, but there are rarely more than sort of 5 part-time staff during most of its history, and that's almost still the case now. The helpline, once it was launched in the back of a charity shop in a rough bit of Bristol, almost immediately became used nationally. So almost immediately, this little local service became actually a national service. And one of the reasons for that was this kind of bold media strategy that the early founding members of Bristol Crisis Service for Women had. So here you can see a couple of articles, and actually the women pictured in those articles are founding members of the Bristol Crisis Service for Women. And what they did was went out and so one of these is The Guardian, but they also gave interviews, very detailed interviews about their life histories and the trauma they'd suffered and their personal histories of self-harm to, glossy magazines like Elle and Chat, kind of women's coffee shop magazines. And they also went on telly, if you're old enough to remember, programs like Kilroy, and talked about their life histories there. And it was a very successful strategy in that it really massively publicised the helpline. And calls shot up, but it was at a personal cost to the women who were exposing themselves to the media like that. And the media strategy changed later, but this is how they got their message out there at the start. This has been touched on by Jeanette in her talk, but one thing that really struck me as a woman with young children was reading in the archive papers of Bristol Crisis Service Women about the paid childcare for all people that volunteered, all the women that volunteered on the helpline. They got their childcare costs paid for if they had children that needed babysitters at home, and meetings had creches. So it was a women-only organisation, very focused on women's needs to be able to participate in the organisation. So I won't talk you through all these slides. They published their first self-help guide, Women and Self-Injury, in 1990. And then probably the next most important part of the history of the organisation is 1995, when they published a really groundbreaking report called Women and Self-Injury, a survey of 76 women. What's really blown my mind as a researcher, a historian researching into this, is this report is considered really groundbreaking. And it's considered groundbreaking simply because it asked women who were using self-injury why they were using self-injury and what help they needed. And that was basically something people hadn't really tried before. Many people have written about self-injury, but they didn't actually ask the women why they were self-injuring and what help they needed. And it was that in itself was radical, is something I think says a lot about the state of mental health care at the time, but it also says something a lot about the organisation. And I think this is at the nub of one of the things why the history of Bristol Crisis Service for Women is important, is because the way they used listening was not just as a therapeutic device to listen to women phoning into the helpline who were distressed, but they also used active listening as the basis of their activism. So they had the group of people they wanted to help. They listened really, really carefully to what those people wanted and needed, and they used that as the basis of their further action. And that was really important, and it shaped all kinds of things that they did. So, for example, the helpline didn't advise women that they should stop using self-injury, because so many women were saying, I need this. This is what helps me get through the day. If I didn't have this, I might do something worse. I don't know how I'd cope. So that set them apart from many, many other services that were dealing with self-injury at the time. And listening to the user's voice, the service user's voice, putting them at the heart of everything they did, also shaped what kind of training they offered, the message they took out into the world. And it was really, really important. Okay, so carrying on with that listening theme, in the 2000s and 2010s, the Bristol Crisis Service for Women did more research and more training, and they sought out particularly the most marginalised groups they could think of, the women that were really, really not being listened to. So they co-produced work with women in prisons, They, in collaboration with Bristol University, did a really big, important project with people with learning disabilities who were using self-harm. They did a project with Black and minority ethnic women, and they even, very sadly, in 2003, produced the most successful publication that Bristol Crisis Service for Women's ever produced, the Rainbow Journal, which was a self-help journal diary for women, because women, not for women, for children, sorry, that's a Freudian slip, because children were also phoning in and saying they were struggling with self-injury. So in 2002, they did stop being a collective. One of the women we interviewed as part of the oral histories talked about the tyranny of structurelessness, and by 2002, they'd given up on the democratic decision-making aspect, and they changed over to a more conventional management structure. But they still tried very much as possible to have a kind of a flat hierarchy, if that's not an oxymoron. In 2008, they expanded services to. They expanded the helpline to include a text and email service, and that was specifically aimed at women under 25 because there was rising use of self-injury there. And that had the unintended benefits of, although it was aimed at younger women, it actually turned out that text messages were a perfectly valid way of offering support. To me, it seems like a text would be a hard way to help someone who is in real distress, but it really worked. And it also opened the service up to other women who couldn't ring in, either because they found talking about the issues that they had experienced that were making them use self-injury so awful they couldn't talk about it, or simply because they lived in unsafe places. They might have had abusive partners and they couldn't speak freely. And so the text service would launch in 2008, and the email service not only broadened the service out to younger women by having new technologies that younger people use, but it actually made it more inclusive for everyone. In 2010, the organisation won the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service, which is pretty much the highest honour a voluntary organisation can get, which was ironic because in 2011, the phone helpline had to shut down because they couldn't get any funding for it. And that remained closed until 2014. And in 2014, the phone line had reopened alongside the text and email, and the organisation changed its name to Self-Injury Support from Bristol Crisis Service for Women. It did that because it had not been a Bristol-only service almost from the beginning, so that wasn't an accurate description. It also wanted to reflect that people don't only use self-injury in a time of crisis. Some people use it as a long-term coping strategy. And also self-injury support really just does what it says on the tin. So it's a slightly blander name. Lots of the people we interviewed said that they missed the old Bristol Crisis Service for Women name and logo, but it made the title more inclusive. And the last thing to bring you up to speed is in 2020, in the heart of the pandemic, we actually started a face-to-face service for people presenting at A&E in hospitals local to us in Bristol. And they could, people presenting with self-inflicted injuries who weren't on a mental health pathway can come and have a kind of a supportive one-to-one session with a lived experience worker from self-injury support. And that's interesting because that service is open not just to women, but to men as well. So 34 years after being created, self-injury support, Bristol Crisis Service as one, is still running national support services and face-to-face services locally. It still exists. It is a real achievement and an important success story. So I just want to go on briefly to the issues that came out most strongly while we were doing the oral history interviews. And there's three of them, really, three themes that really came to light from the interviews. And the first of these is, why is the history important? And the history of Bristol Crisis Service for Women is really important, and Jeanette's really touched on these themes before. The mental health is an overlooked aspect of feminist history. Bristol Crisis Service for Women said women's mental health is a feminist issue. Mental health is a feminist issue that we should pay attention to. And they gave a structural context to women's personal distress. They put self-injury within a societal, political context that helped women understand why they were suffering so much. Because so many women were being told that they were mad or they had a personality disorder and that their self-injury was completely illogical and couldn't be explained. And Bristol Crisis Service Women said it can be explained. It can be explained by the abuse you suffer at the hands of your partner or the abuse that you've suffered as a child. And unfortunately, that's because the women phoning in were talking about terrible trauma often suffered as in the form of childhood sexual abuse. And there was a clear link between women using self-injury in adulthood and violence at the hands of men and sexual violence at the hands of men, often in childhood. So it's a feminist issue because self-injury, there is a link between self-injury and male violence. And that's why Bristol Crisis Service for Women wanted to be a women-only service and thought it was important to have women's spaces. It wasn't because they were saying men don't use self-injury; they absolutely do. But they were saying the women that use their service need a safe space because often the causes of their self-injury lie in trauma suffered at the hands of men. They also thought that self-injury is a feminist issue because of the very gendered way that women were treated when they sought help for their self-injury. So many women who were ringing the helpline and women who were volunteering at the organisation who had lived experience of being, when they presented with self-injury, they were being dismissed as silly attention-seeking girls or being told that they were trying to manipulate people with their self-injury, or being told they must be mad if they were doing this, or they must have a personality disorder. Many women who phoned the helpline said no one ever asked when they went to A&E, no one asked them why they were self-injuring. There was a complete lack of interest in why they were unhappy, but a dismissal or disapproval of their behaviour. And they felt that this not listening to them was because they were women, and that they felt that self-injury was not an acceptable way for women to show distress. So rather than it being interpreted as an evidence of the real depth of distress and anger, self-injury, because it was women using it, was interpreted as crazy, as madness, or evidence of a kind of manipulative evidence, maybe of a personality disorder. So the next theme that came out really, really strongly, which is linked in the interviews, was the experience of the volunteers. The women who came to volunteer at Bristol Crisis Service for Women had a really transformative experience. And it was quite striking how the same words and the same kind of effusive description of their experience of volunteering, and particularly going through the training that you needed to go through to become a helpline volunteer, how transformative that was. And that was tied into the fact that it was delivered in women-only sessions. So the training was quite long, could be up to 10 days. And it was very much almost like a group therapy session. And the women found it really supportive, and aspects that really impacted them were the democratic nature of it, and the way that Bristol Crisis Service for Women said that your personal experience is all the expertise you need. They felt listened to, they felt supported, and that feeling of being held by their colleagues and supported and valued and listened to actually had a tremendous effect on the people who came to volunteer at Bristol Crisis Service for Women. When we were doing the interviews and you'd say, and what's your profession now? You'd be like, oh, another psychotherapist, because an enormous number of people who volunteered at Bristol Crisis Service for Women decided that a career in psychotherapy and psychology or counselling was for them. Obviously, some people volunteered with that in mind, but a number of people told us that they had found their calling by their experience of being at Bristol Crisis Service for Women. And another important thing that women in the interviews told us was that because they felt so safe and so held and so listened to while they were at Bristol Crisis Service for Women, that they were able, maybe for the first time in their lives, to disclose trauma in their own past and actually seek therapy for that. So in that way, that was transformative for people. They thought they were coming to Bristol Crisis Service to help other people, and in fact were deeply helped themselves by the experience. And I would argue that it was because of the kind of feminine way that Bristol Crisis Service for Women worked and the safe space that was there, because it was a women-only service, that enabled a lot of that. So far more, I'll just leave these quotes up a bit because this speaks to what I was just talking about. The last theme that came up is very boring, actually, but it definitely ought to be mentioned. The last theme that came up was funding, and all the people we interviewed who actually worked for a Bristol Crisis Service for Women and self-injury support talked about the stress of always scrabbling around trying to find funding for the work that they were doing, and how the negative impact of the way that small charities are funded, or kind of short-term project funding, how that doesn't allow you to do work that's strategic and plan for the future. And people also mentioned that the good work, the effort they were putting in to support women phoning in on the helpline, it was being undercut more recently, particularly by cuts to statutory mental health funding. That meant, that fewer and fewer services were out there to help people in the NHS. So I won't bore you with all my fascinating oral history methodology talk, but feel free to ask me about it afterwards. But I do want to do a bit of a sales talk about the resources that we've created out of this project. So you can find most of these by visiting the project website, which is www.womenlisteningtowomen.org.uk. And on there, you can find all of the 3 podcasts. We had an amazing podcast producer called Marnie Woodmead, who came along and used the oral history interviews to create 3 half-hour podcasts that explore different aspects of the history of Bristol Crisis Service for Women. They're really, really good. I urge you to listen to them. They're on our project website. They're also on most podcast streaming platforms, including Spotify. We've created a lovely glossy colour illustrated booklet with a narrative history of the organisation. You can download that from the website, or if you go on the website and send me an email, I'll send you a hard copy for free. Please do. I'd love to hear from you. As I mentioned before, all the oral histories we collected, both audio files and transcriptions, and 17 boxes of paper archive charting the history of Bristol Crisis Service for Women, have now been deposited at Bishopsgate Institute. They'll be cataloguing those this year, and hopefully later on this year, in this autumn, they should be made public. It will be the Bristol Crisis Service and Self-Injury Support Collection, and that will be part of Jeanette's Women and Mental Health Activism archive. So that's fantastic. And lastly, here in Bristol, we have these 2 wonderful exhibitions that explain all about the history of the organisation and the experience of volunteering on the helpline. And they are interactive and multimedia because they all contain QR codes that you can scan with your smartphone, and actually you can hear the voices of the women speaking, not just reading them. So those are actually on display in Bristol Central Library right now, but very soon they should be back in our office. And if you want one for your conference, or, just to make your living room look lovely, you can contact us and we can arrange for you to borrow those free of charge, as long as you're fairly local. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you very much.
Rosie, thank you so much for that. I have to say, it touched my heart. I think it went back to Jeanette of that they won't listen to me. And I very rarely say that I have a diagnosed personality disorder, because you want people just to hear your distress. And I think what it demonstrated to me was how much this service right from the start was needed, and straight away spread beyond Bristol. And it's just, for me, heartwarming that this service has been there and is still there, and how important it is. Just want to thank everybody who has spoken in terms of just how inspirational it is, and the fact that this work is still going on, and how it's sort of led to this point, and how it goes forward. So I want to thank everybody who has spoken. I want to thank everybody who has come and listened. I might hand over to Francis, maybe just to say that where you can get the resources for these sessions, just before we kind of leave each other.
Yeah, I'll just, I'm going to add myself so people can see. Yeah, so we have been recording this session. So people can see this with the slides recorded and everything on our previous events page on the RCN website. So I'll post that in the chat in a minute. And I posted it above as well, but I'll post it again. And then I've also put a link to our survey in the chat as well. So please do just click on that. It takes 1 minute, and just let us know if you enjoyed the event and if you found it helpful. Oh, thank you. Sarah Bond has just put it in the chat for us. So look out for it on that page.
So I think that's it, really. So thank you so much for everybody joining, for everyone who spoke. And I hope we have something like this again at the RCN Library, because it was really inspiring. So thank you so much.